Now that we've looked at some of the evidence from rocks and fossils and from the movement of the Earth's plates, now let's look at some of the evidence from living things, from biology. And we're going to start with evidence from anatomy. And the first thing in your notes are what's called homologous structures. Homologous structures have a similar feature that has come from a common ancestor. So for example, you know that certain families or traits are passed down, whether that's hair color or the way their face looks or their height or different traits. The same thing is saying here. We're saying that a homologous feature is a trait that you have because your ancestors had it. Now, we're not usually looking at hair color and things like that. We're looking at broader things. But if you take a look at these examples here, you'll notice that all of these animals have the exact same bone structure in their limbs. In fact, all tetrapods, meaning all four-limbed animals, have this same bone structure. It's always one bone, two bones, small bones, finger bones. And it doesn't matter whether you're looking at the bat, the horse, the human, the dolphin, it's the same pattern. Like if you're looking at my arm, there's one bone, there's two bones, there's small bones of the wrist, there's the carpal bones, and then the finger bones. And that same thing is in the bat. That same thing is in the horse. Although you'll notice, oddly enough, in a horse, if you've ever been around horses, the reason you think their knees maybe kind of bend the wrong way, because that's not their knee, that's their wrist. Their knee is way up there. See where the purple, the yellow, and the green meet? The yellow and the green is actually the forearm of the horse's leg. What you would maybe think of the horse's knee is its wrist, and it's actually standing on its tippy toes. But they've been modified. They're the same bones as what we would think of as fingers, but they've been modified into feet, hooves, that they're like standing on. But it's the exact same structure. So the only way that we think that this could have happened naturally is to get the exact same bone structure in all of these animals is if the common ancestor that they came from, there was some animal long ago that had this bone structure, and that maybe all of these animals are descendants from that animal, and that's why they all have a similar bone structure. So that's a homologous feature. Make sure that you remember that. Homo means same. So that means you have the same trait or a similar trait because it came from a common ancestor. That's the key. Analogous features are different. Analogous features are you have a similar feature, but it's not because it came from a common ancestor. So if we look here, here's three animals with homologous structures, right? A bat wing, a bird wing, and like a pterosaur wing. They all have wings, but they didn't come from the same place. Like sorry, let me be clear here. The homologous feature in these bottom three is the bone structure, right? You see the one bone, two bones, small bones, finger bones, right? Orange, green, yellow. That part is homologous, but the purple part, the wing part, is not. Right? They may not, like, for example, this had feathers. This one has a membrane or skin stretched out basically between its fingers. Pterosaurs were similar. And then the moth or the insect, whatever that might, it has wings, but not because it came from a common ancestor. Its common ancestor, I mean, there's no bone structure there. There's nothing like that. It just happened to have evolved a wing. It was an advantage for it to have a wing, and so it developed a wing. So that trait, because it did not come from a common ancestor, would be analogous. If you were looking at a family tree, for something to be homologous, it would have to be in everything coming down the tree, right? This one had, let's say, the bone structure, right? The same bone structure. So did this one, 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 all the way down. Analogous features would be the ancestor didn't have wings, neither did these guys, neither did these guys, and then suddenly these guys showed up starting to have wings, and so did these guys. And even though both of them have wings now, it's not because they got it from a common ancestor, it's because they developed wings separately. That's the distinction between homologous and analogous. So homologous means all of our ancestors had it back to that common ancestor. Analogous features are, no, this developed, we didn't get it from that way back common ancestor. Even though this animal and this animal both have wings, if you follow back up the family tree, they didn't all have wings, so it's not a homologous feature. Okay, the next one is called embryology, and that means the science of studying embryos. So if you look at embryos, let me get me out of the way here for a second. Take a look at those embryos. Every one of those embryos is a different species. But at this point in their development, they all look almost identical. Right? They all have the little eye, they all have these little gill slits, they all have a tail. Those structures are similar in all of these embryos. But if we move up, you can see that these embryos all become very different animals. From a fish, to a tortoise, to a hog, to a rabbit, to us. But all of the embryos are nearly identical. So that also is a piece of evidence that suggests we must have had a common ancestor at some point, and that's where that shape of the embryo started, and it just has modified and changed over time in each species to be slightly different to end up with a different result. But at that beginning part, we were very, very similar. We had gill slits, and we all had a tail. Even humans, you had a tail. It was there. Some of you might have had a tail when you were born. I don't know. If you did, please send me a message because I want to know that. It's very interesting. Humans, if they do, though, it's very, very small, and they usually just go in and surgically correct the bones so that they're tucked under your pelvis and not out. But anyway, that's beside the point. But there's no reason for us to have these same structures if it wasn't something that came from a common ancestor. The reason we don't have gills is the gill slits in humans turn into the bones of our inner ear. So if you take anatomy later on or take the med prep class, the hammer, the anvil, the stirrup, the incus malleus stapes that are inside little tiny bones inside your ear that let you hear, they came from your gill slits. Where in fish, they turn into gills. So they've just adapted what the structures turn into has changed over time. Okay. The last part here is vestigial features. And these are features that we have that we don't use. And the only reason they make sense for them to be there is if we got them from a common ancestor. But since we don't use them, they're not very well developed and they're very small. So for example, in a whale, everything here makes sense, right? They have the baleen for straining out food. Here's that common bone structure we talked about that was homologous. But they have a pelvis, like a hip bone, and kind of the beginnings of like what would have been a leg bone. But whales don't have hips, they don't have legs. So there's no reason for a whale to have a pelvis, unless a whale's ancestor had a pelvis, and that over time, because it didn't use it, it's become smaller and less well developed. And maybe one day in the future, thousands and maybe millions of years in the future, maybe that pelvis will just entirely disappear. That's a vestigial feature. Something that is there, but it's not really functional, it's not really necessary. It's a useless piece, for lack of a better way of saying it. Some snakes, for example, also have these little arm buds. So you can see the circle on that picture there, and also right here. There's these little buds, and it's not just, this isn't just some weird mutant snake. All of the snakes of that species have that little bud there. That doesn't make sense. It does nothing for this snake. It doesn't use them. It's not used for catching food or holding on to anything or mating, nothing. It's just a leftover. Pythons and boa constrictors, the same thing. There's a certain part on the body where you can kind of see where there's almost the remains of like a pelvis and like a little limb bud where maybe their ancestors used to have legs. In fact, we found fossils of snake-like creatures that used to have legs. But over time, maybe it was a disadvantage. Maybe they couldn't get into tighter spaces, or maybe whatever it might have been, over time they've gotten smaller and smaller until they've basically gone away. Fish that live in caves still have eyes. In a pitch black cave, you don't see it there because it's clear, there's no pigment, but there is still the structures in that flat, basically see-through fish. There still is the structures of an eye, but they don't work, because why would they work? It's pitch black. There's no reason for a fish who lives in an absolutely pitch black cave to have eyes, unless that fish came from a fish that hundreds and maybe thousands of years ago had an eye, but since the fish didn't need it, the fish stopped using it. And so if fish were born that were blind or that didn't use their eyes, that may have been an advantage for them because they weren't trying to send nutrients and energy and using brain power to try to figure out what they were seeing. That energy could have gone somewhere else to benefit them. Those are vestigial features. Basically leftovers from a common ancestor we don't use anymore. But they shouldn't be there unless there was that common ancestor. Now, let me show you this. So here's up at the top, here's the hippopotamus. And we think hippopotamus separated from its common ancestor about 55 million years ago. Not very long after, well, relatively speaking. The dinosaurs disappeared 65 million years ago. So about 10 years after the dinosaurs disappeared, hippopotamus branched off from its common ancestor and started to become different. These guys, we think, are the first kind of relatives. So Indo-Hyas, the Pachycetus, and the Ambulocetus. At each branch, though, they've become slightly modified. So you'll see Indo-Hyas is kind of like an anteater looking sort of creature. And what they developed was the thick bony wall around the middle ear that allowed them to move between fresh water and kind of back and forth between the water and the land. If we move down here, you can see that in the next step, when we separate the Pachycetus from the ones below it, the ones below it developed a large, powerful tail, shorter legs, and kind of like webbed feet that allowed them to spend more time probably in an aquatic environment. They would have been better swimmers because they had that tail for maneuverability and for propulsion. And they didn't need big, long legs. They needed small legs with kind of webbed appendages that allowed them to propel themselves in the water. So you can see as we go down, it's just small changes. The head gets a little bit longer, the tail gets a little bit bigger, the feet get a little bit smaller, or the legs. And small changes eventually lead us to things like Durodon, where the back legs are almost entirely gone. And then eventually down to animals that we still have, they didn't go extinct. Things like the odontocetes, like the dolphins, and the mystocetes, which are the whales. Now let me show you another part of this. If I back up here, take a look at this skull. So this is the skull of something like Pachycetus. You'll see the nose is very close to the front, but let's kind of watch this structure as we go down. You'll see here, very, very similar structure in terms of the skull, but the nose is starting to move backwards. And that probably is an adaptation. Whoa, where are we jumping here? That probably was an adaptation for moving into spending more time in the water. Having your nose up on the top of your head so you don't have to like stick your head right out of the water to breathe. You can just surface a little bit. Your nose is right here so you can take a breath and then you can go back down. And then the farther we go down, you can see in Durodon that nose is even farther back. And then when we get to the dolphins and the whales, that hole is actually way back here, and we consider it the blowhole. It's actually their nose. It's just back behind on the back of their head so that they can surface breathe out, breathe in some oxygen, and then go back into the water. But it shows us this actually a really well documented flow of, you can see the bones, the fossils in the fossil record, little tiny changes where it's not like suddenly a hippopotamus jumped into the water and grew a tail, but whatever that common ancestor, which probably didn't look like a hippopotamus, by the way, but just little changes, you know. Maybe this one had a little bit bigger tail, so he had an advantage eating in the water, so he spent more time in the water. Maybe his offspring had shorter legs, and maybe that gave them an advantage. And over time, somebody had a weird nose that was farther up on their head, but hey, it gave them an advantage. And over thousands of years and millions of years and generations and generations and generations, those traits changed enough, kind of like we talked about with species, where they became new species. They weren't interbreeding with their relatives anymore, or at least the similar organisms. And they became so different that we've become totally different. And you can see that over time, you can go from something like this that walked on land and spent maybe some time in the water, to eventually species that are completely aquatic. So maybe the reason the whale has that vestigial pelvis is because its relatives up here had a pelvis, but it just wasn't an advantage for them. And so over time, that structure has been lost. Okay, so that's kind of just a good example that shows kind of the flow of where this all works together. The next one I want to show you is there's a good picture that shows the whole thing if you want to pause and kind of look at that, read up on it, look at the changes in the skull if you want. The next thing in your notes is protein analysis. So looking at biochemistry, meaning the chemical composition of us, of our bodies. If we compare our proteins, now this is only a very specific protein, human hemoglobin polypeptide, which is something that's in your hemoglobin, which is what carries oxygen in your blood. The structure, the recipe for how you make hemoglobin is 95% the same as a rhesus monkey. It's 87% the same as a mouse, 69% chicken, 54% of a frog, and 14% similar to a lamprey. So the reason we would assume that the proteins, the sequence of the amino acids in the proteins are similar would be because you're more related, right? If you looked at a whale and a dolphin, we would expect that they probably have very similar proteins because they probably had a common ancestor. And so we can kind of map out relationships, not just based on what bones are kind of similar shape, but now using this, we can actually say, no, based on their proteins, I think these ones fit better here or here, and these ones are closer related than those ones. We can also do DNA comparisons. Now, hopefully you remember from other science courses that DNA is made up of things like adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. Those are the 4 nitrogenous bases. But the sequence of them, the order of that, for lack of a better term, language of those letters tells us how to spell out the recipe for what you're making. And if we look at DNA comparison, we have 98% almost exactly identical DNA to a chimp. 90% of your DNA is a cat. If I could change 10% of your DNA, I could make you a cat. 60% to a cow, 82% for a platypus, and 71% for a fish. The exact same DNA. 71% of my DNA is exactly the same as that fish. So that tells us that life on Earth probably came from a common place. Probably all was based on that DNA molecule. And then it's just little tiny mutations, little tiny changes that make a really big difference in how these things look. I'll send a couple of videos linked to this that you guys can watch if you want. Really interesting stuff about where corn came from. I know that sounds boring, but if you watch it, it's actually very interesting. And probably that one I mentioned before about the dinosaurs. So the last piece of evidence I want to show, and before I move on, there are even things called vestigial genes, where we might have, or some animals might have, a gene that codes for something, a certain molecule or a protein that we don't use anymore. Maybe an ancestor produced some kind of a protein or something, but we don't need it. So we still have the gene, it's still in our DNA, but it's been turned off so that our body doesn't read it, it doesn't produce that protein anymore. Just like we talked about vestigial features, we have vestigial genes, which wouldn't make sense. Why would they be there unless they were passed down to us from a common ancestor? The last piece is from artificial selection. Now, we've talked about this before, that all dogs really are the same species. They came from probably a wolf that was domesticated a long, long time ago. But because we bred for certain traits, dogs have changed their appearance. So if you wanted little tiny dogs you could put in your purse, then you would take that little boy dog and that little girl dog and make them have puppies. And then you would take the smallest ones of those and breed them with this small dog, and until eventually their offspring got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Or maybe you wanted big guard dogs, or maybe you wanted fur balls, or maybe you wanted, I don't know what you would want that for. I'm not saying it's a bad dog, I just don't know what its purpose was, like why it was bred. I know some dogs were hunting dogs, some dogs were guard dogs, some dogs were made for companionship, but they were all bred for slightly different traits. Right? Artificially, we selected that boy dog and that girl dog because I like their traits and I want to see if I can get some pups that are kind of like it. And over time, you got all these different breeds of dogs, but really they're all still the same species. We've done the same thing with plants. So if you take the wild mustard plant, for example, and depending on what you selectively bred for, you get all of these other vegetables. So kohlrabi, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, and kale, they're really all the same species. We've just bred them for different things. So if we wanted broccoli, for example, we bred wild mustard plants that had the trait of different flower buds. So what you're really eating when you eat broccoli is a bunch of unopened flower buds, hopefully with cheese sauce all over them. Or cauliflower, which are kind of the same thing, but the flower buds are a little bit different. Brussels sprouts, where the leaf buds grow on the sides, and you're just eating the little leaf buds before they have a chance to open and turn into leaves. Or cabbage, instead of buds along the edge, there's a bud on the end of the stem, and the stem is very short, so there's just a cabbage, looks like a head of lettuce. And kale, not really in a bud at all, just leaves. But they're all the same plant. We've just, as humans, selected different traits until we got them to be different things. So since we've artificially done that with dogs and with things like wild mustard and lots and lots and lots of other crops, it starts to make sense that maybe if we can do this artificially, maybe this happened naturally. Maybe that common ancestor of the hippo naturally started to grow slightly different from the other ones until there were traits that gave an advantage in the water, or traits that gave an advantage on land, or whatever. And as more and more time happened and more new traits showed up, eventually they started to separate into different species. So that's it for this section. If there's anything I missed in the notes or anything that's unclear, or if you have any questions about anything, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask, and I'll do my best to clear it up for you.